live long and prosper. So in this video series, I'm going to be talking through the social justice elements of every episode of the original series of Star Trek. The thing that inspired this project was actually a Fox News article which argued that Star Trek has in some way betrayed its traditional commitment to sort of political neutrality or middle ground by embracing progressive politics. In this series, we're going to see that Star Trek has always embraced progressive politics, and it's always been aspirational for social justice in various senses. I am taking a broad perspective on social justice here, so that may include multiple different types of social justice, whether that's racial, whether that's economic, whether that's religious, whether that's abilities, gender and sexuality, anything broadly considered. I will go through every episode. Some of the episodes I will interview fellow Trekkies and talk with them about it. And then below, in the descriptions, I will give you additional information about the episodes, particularly their original air date, who wrote the screenplay, and who directed that episode. I also want to dedicate this series to my dad, Michael Allen Zapkin. He was an OG Trekkie from back in the day, and it was watching the original series with him that I came to love Star Trek.
In this video, we're going to be talking about the episode Space Seed. And I'm joined for this discussion by Dr. Jeff Yeager, my good friend who I was at West Virginia University with in our doctoral programs. I'm going to let Jeff briefly introduce himself. He's going to give us a short plot description of Space Seed, and then we're going to talk about the social justice themes. So Jeff, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, glad to be here, Phil. For those who don't know me, I'm Dr. Jeff Yeager. I'm soon to be an assistant professor of English at Bluefield State University in Bluefield, West Virginia. So I've always been a big Star Trek fan, so definitely eager to talk about this episode. So Space Seed is it's definitely a classic episode. A lot of the reason why is because they later made Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan based off of this episode. But it's a classic episode. So the crew of the Enterprise discovers this sort of 20th century ship floating in space, and they find that all the inhabitants on the ship are frozen. They're waiting to be woken up. So upon waking them up, when they first wake up Khan, who is the leader of the crew. But after doing some historical research, they realized that this guy Khan was a 20th century dictator who was genetically engineered to be superior to the rest of humanity, and both superior, right, in both physical strength as well as intellect. So, being who he is, a cunning Machiavellian guy, he maneuvers to take over the Enterprise with help from the ship's historian. It was Lieutenant, right? Lieutenant McGivers?
Yeah, McGivern, I think.
McGivern, yeah. So, who falls in love with him really quickly. So, and of course, it doesn't work out for Khan. He is Kirk with a change of heart from McGivers. Takes back the Enterprise and then later abandons Khan and his crew and McGivers on a planet with some parallels to Australia. with the penal colonies in Australia.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it.
All right. So there's a lot of social justice stuff to potentially talk about with this episode. I think it's worth potentially starting. I mean, you had said this. One of the reasons this is such an important episode is because it introduces the character of Coon, who is this eugenic. He's a product of the eugenics wars, which Star Trek imagined occurred in the 1990s. And he's a product of selective breeding and genetic engineering. So let's start with that. This question of eugenics and selective breeding and genetic engineering and the desire to create superior humans.
Yeah, so as this episode, of course, the original series was filmed in the 60s, and the eugenics movement was definitely fresh on people's minds then.
Yeah.
Maybe even then compared to now, because in the early 20th century, the eugenics movement was very widespread in the United States as well as in Europe, of course.
Yeah.
Of course, we know that the eugenics movement helped fuel the Nazi movement in Germany. And so science fiction has always, especially in this time period, science fiction has always imagined like the consequences of the eugenics movement.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another example I can think of is the James Bond film Moonraker. That's another example of eugenics gone wrong in sci-fi. Yeah, it is. This show definitely imagines the consequences of what could happen with this selective breeding, and of course, the show even kind of shows you the dangers of it. With Coon might be a step above people in IQ and strength, but his ego is also a step above.
Yeah, I think it's Spock. It's either Spock or Kirk. I can't remember. Who says one of the things the scientists forgot is that superior ability breeds superior ambition. So yeah, I mean, Khan's whole quest, basically, as soon as he's revived, is I'm going to take over the Enterprise, and then I'm going to use the Enterprise to take over the galaxy. But the thing that I think is maybe really interesting here, I mean, you mentioned the Nazis. Of course, fascism is a eugenics-based movement. It is built out of the idea that some races or ethnicities or groups of people are inherently superior to others. But if fascism teaches us anything, it's that you don't need eugenically superior people. You don't need genetic engineering to get a set of fascist dictators who seize power in a number of countries. So I think World War II is a really interesting context here because, yeah, the story that they tell in the episode is in the mid-1990s, about 40 of the genetically engineered people, or about 100 of the genetically engineered people seized power in about 40 countries, something like that. But of course, history tells us you don't actually need the genetic engineering step to get to brutal dictatorships. So I think that's a really interesting, it's an interesting element when we think about, when we compare and contrast the eugenics wars described in Space Seed versus World War II.
Yeah, and we need not remind everyone that Hitler himself, even though he prioritized that, he himself was not Aryan.
Yeah.
The great irony World War II in that regard.
Yeah. He was not an Ubermensch, despite the idea that he was ushering in the era of the Ubermensch.
Yeah, that you're leading us down a good path here, Phil, which is with the Nietzschean philosophy of Übermensch. Was Nietzsche imagined this Übermensch figure as not even from slightly from a eugenics point of view, but also as this person who is above, above the ethics and mores of society. And he's someone who the Übermensch is, of course, Superman. The figure of Superman sort of comes from this.
Yeah.
But of course, Nietzsche was very critical of Christianity.
Yeah.
So he saw the Übermensch as a person who would redefine ethics without religion.
Yeah. Beyond good and evil, to take one of the titles of Nietzsche's books. Yeah, I actually think that's a really important point. For me, the way that, so I think it's worth noting very explicitly, the Nazis really perverted Nietzsche's philosophy. Nietzsche actually said, the Germans suck. The Germans are a terrible race. And somehow the Nazis read that and were like, clearly, according to Nietzschean philosophy, the Germans are the super race. But I think your point that you'd made is absolutely the right one. At least the way that I read Nietzsche, it's not about like a better human being, somebody who's more evolved, more adept, physically stronger, smarter, whatever it is. It's somebody who has, I think Nietzsche might call it the moral courage to take the step beyond ethics, beyond morality, beyond questions of good and evil, and to simply embrace these life energies that Nietzsche is so interested in. And I think that raises an interesting question, like especially in the context of Space Seed, because I do want us to stay talking about this episode and not get too far into the Nietzsche rabbit hole. Does that transcendence of conventional morality, does that embrace of life as Nietzsche would understand it, inherently require violence or domination of others?
No, like if we would look at Superman, for instance, Superman is often seen, of course, Superman's got super strength and all this, but he's not a superhero. He's not a superhero because of his violence as much as the sort of example that he shows the rest of the world. He's different than a human, but he's also above humanity and ethical, moral scope. No, I don't think that you have to have violence here, which is something I think with Khan, he is definitely of that mindset. Of course, he's a warlord.
Yeah.
This also sort of takes us in another direction, which is how Khan is compared to other great warlords throughout history in the episode. I think they mentioned Genghis Khan, Caesar,
Napoleon.
Yeah,
Alexander is the other big one.
Always Alexander.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it seems like we're sort of trying to focus in on like these great military leaders who changed the world in some way. Alexander definitely did. He spread Hellenistic culture throughout all of Europe.
Yeah, definitely.
But the others, maybe their contributions are more overstated. But perhaps.
Possibly.
But it is interesting that the show sort of, maybe not the show, McGivers.
Yes.
Definitely sort of pushes in with those others.
Yeah, she's very much. I want to talk about her because she's a really interesting character. She's very much invested in this great man narrative of history, which in the 60s, that actually wasn't unusual. Like that was a very standard way of understanding history. Today, a lot of historians have attempted to break down that particular narrative with greater or lesser success. But the thing that I find really fascinating about McGivern is she fetishizes great men. And I mean that both in the sense of her conception of history is built around these great men. She has in her quarters paintings that she's done of Richard the Lionheart, Leif Erikson, Caesar, all of these different great men. But she's also romantically or sexually attracted to them. Like, this is part of the reason why she falls in love with Coon pretty much immediately. In this way that I find just really hard to believe, particularly since as a historian, she knows what Coon did as a dictator. But that sort of fetishization and sexualization of history, I think, is a really, really interesting element of her character. What do you make of that?
It's particularly interesting when you put it in the scope of like what the Federation of Planets is supposed to symbolize.
Yeah,
Peace, and like it's almost this communism, gone good sort of society.
Yeah.
So yeah, it is. You would think that in a society like that, the historians at that point would maybe focus more on maybe broader scope, his economic history or social history or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, she does seem to be stuck in an early 20th century historical mindset, prioritizing these great figures. And this type of history is still prominent today. I mean, you still have the big biographies of all the presidents and generals and all of this stuff. But the wider historical field is much more all-encompassing. And yeah, she does have that early 20th century mindset about the great men. And I don't, as far as her attraction to Coon goes, I think that's definitely part of it. But Coon, it's hard to argue that Ricardo Montalban, who plays Coon, doesn't have this sort of magnetism about him.
Yeah.
Yeah, he, like the way that he could just like stare into your soul, right? You know, he's definitely got this magnetic quality about him that she definitely sort of gravitates to quickly.
I wonder if, I mean, I'm just kind of thinking of the famous Sylvia Plath lines from the poem Daddy, right? Every woman adores a fascist. The brute face, the brute heart of a brute like you. I mean, I think that's actually an incredibly problematic idea, in part because it really justifies violence against women, patriarchal domination, and we see this with Coon, right? Like there's a scene after the dinner where Spock basically interrogates Coon and Kirk sort of is watching Coon's reactions. There's a scene in Coon's chamber when McGivern has come in, and it's a very difficult scene to watch, actually, because he is emotionally abusive. Like, he basically, when she's like, I don't really want to betray the Enterprise, he's like, then go away. And she's like, I'd like to stay. And he's like, you have to ask to stay. So there's this emotional abuse element, this manipulative element, but then also he physically grabs her hand. And remember, they've established Khan is supposed to be about 5 times stronger than a normal human being. He could very easily then crush the bones in her hand, and there was nothing that she could do to stop him. And he appears to be well on the way to doing that. So we have, like, I think that idea of, like, the sexual attractiveness of fascists, and that women in particular are sexually attracted to fascists, I think is an incredibly problematic idea because it justifies these kinds of abusive behaviors.
Yeah.
You have a different take on that.
Doesn't he slap Uhura? Was it Uhura?
Somebody else does. Yeah.
Yeah. I remember she got in the way of him from doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is part of the reason why she later helps Kirk, is because the spell, like that sort of initial infatuation, maybe wanes a bit.
Yeah.
She sort of starts seeing the real person that he is. Of course, she later decides to accept banishment on the planet with Khan instead of accepting a court-martial or crew. So maybe the change of heart wasn't fully there. But yeah, I mean, it is definitely problematic sexual politics for the time period. It's definitely this very machismo type of relationship between the two.
Yeah. I mean, I've said this before in episodes for this series and videos for this series. Like, as much as Star Trek is supposed to be set in a gender equitable society, it is very important to remember this is the 60s' idea of what a gender equitable society might look like, coming out of a very distinctly patriarchal culture.
Yeah, Kirk and several other episodes also has very problematic relationships with women. So Khan isn't alone here. Kirk himself has some interesting relationships.
Definitely. Actually, also with McGivern in this episode. I want to come back to the court-martial and the exiling Khan and his followers, marooning them on the planet, but Kirk is not especially benevolent to McGivern either. Like, the first thing we get, the first assessment he has of her is, it's finally time for that ship's historian to do something, or something like this. Like, this very dismissive attitude toward her. But once they come back from Khan's ship, named the Botany Bay, it's worth noting, Kirk is basically like, you really sucked as part of the landing party. Don't ever fuck up like that again. In a way that we pretty much never see him talk to any male member of a landing party, even when they make egregious mistakes. So is Kirk actually a benevolent alternative to Khan in this relationship with McGivern?
Yeah, I was going to joke that this is what happens to the humanities in a STEM society, but useless historians, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I see your point here, Phil. Like, he is extremely critical of her, and so many other episodes you see people in the landing party mess up for some reason or other. I mean, there's even the jokes about the what collar shirt always dies, isn't it? Yeah. But he definitely seems to make things harder on her because of her gender, maybe because she is a younger lady. disturbing. So, yeah, he's definitely a little chauvinist here with how he treats her. So, yeah, it's no wonder that she's quick to turn on the rest of the crew.
Yeah. So I want to shift a little bit to the end of the episode. You had brought this up, and I think it's a really important thing to consider. At the end of the episode, they have a hearing in which basically Kirk, Spock, McCoy, Scotty put on their Class A uniforms. Kirk rings a bell, and then he's like, this hearing is in session. I'm now going to pass sentence on you. But strangely enough, that sentence is, we're dropping all charges, but also we're going to maroon you on a planet. Then he turns to McGivern and he's like, either you can face a court-martial for betraying the ship, or you can go with them and live on this planet. It seems to me very, very unlikely that under the Federation's uniform code of justice, or whatever sort of military law the Federation has, that Kirk would unilaterally have the authority to just maroon a bunch of people on a planet. Like, I don't, maybe you have a different perspective on that, but to me, yes, this is a convenient way to get rid of Khan and his people without killing them. So you can't really just let them loose in general civilization. And it sets the stage for Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, which you'd mentioned earlier on. But if we're thinking about this in terms of like justice and Kirk's authority, what do you think?
Well, I think one of the reasons why that Kirk treats this differently than any other situation, I think Kirk sees Khan as a worthy foil to him in some ways. He's the Moriarty to the Sherlock.
Okay.
Yeah, like there's a weird mutual respect there between the two, even after all of this, even after all the events that have happened on the ship. So I think like they make the line at the very end of the episode, like, oh, I wonder what it would be like 100 years to come back and see what this planet's like.
Yeah.
I wonder what it would be like. I think Kirk, in addition to this historian on the ship, I think he too has
he's got a crush on Khan as well.
Yeah, definitely a man crush on Khan, right? And I think that's part of the reason why, like, he kind of wants to see what Khan will do.
Okay.
Of course, he later finds out, right?
Yeah. And it's not fantastic. That's the short version of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Things are not fantastic.
Yeah, of course, if we want to go, that could be the subject of another episode if you films, but they don't. I remember they later don't bring McGivern back on that film. I remember. Yeah, there's Khan also makes the Milton references at the end.
Yeah,
which I always find fascinating. Khan's got a very similar taste in literature than me, weirdly, but he gives the classic "better to rule in heaven, better to rule in hell than serve in heaven" line from Lost.
And I'm on board with that as a literary reference. I like literary references. The one thing that I did find very interesting, this is not really important, but it just struck me. The way that Khan just says, have you read Milton, Captain? That's all that Khan says, and he just sort of lets it stand for itself. Then Scotty is like, it's a shame for a good Scotsman to admit it, but I'm not up on Milton. And Kirk gives him that famous line. I don't really understand why being Scottish would have anything to do with having read Milton. because Milton was not Scottish. So, as we learn from later episodes, Scotty's primary reading is technical journals anyway. So
maybe he's thinking about Robert Burns.
I imagine Scotty knows Burns by heart. That never comes up that I remember. But I think that's a pretty good sort of discussion of Space Seed. We've gone through a lot of fairly difficult territory. Any other things that you want to say about Space Seed?
No, I think we've mostly covered everything. The action was really interesting. The way that they did the fight choreography with Kirk and Khan, and like it almost felt like a WWE wrestling match, like they were doing like hurricanranas and all this kind of stuff. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, actually, so you're I think primarily thinking of the big sort of climactic fight at the end where Khan has isolated himself in engineering and Kirk comes in for the big one-on-one face-off. And actually, it does kind of physically look like a wrestling ring, right? Because it's pretty much a square space with control panels along two of the walls, the engines on the other. There's another interesting sort of choreography element in the episode. When they're first reviving Khan, the equipment starts to malfunction and they have to break the glass to get him out quicker. Kirk's phaser falls off his belt as he's breaking that glass, and there's a moment where like you can see DeForest Kelley's eyes follow the phaser as it drops down to the ground, then look up to the director to see if they're gonna cut and do it again. But the theory that I've heard is that they just didn't really have the money to reshoot that scene. So they left it in both with Kirk's phaser falling off, which DeForest Kelley later grabbed off the floor, but also with DeForest Kelley looking up to see if they were going to stop. So
I didn't pick up on that detail. That's interesting.
It's really, really quick, and you kind of have to know that it's coming in order to look for it. But yeah, I mean, Star Trek, of course, was plagued by not having enough money throughout its runtime. But yeah, the physical fighting, I think in this one is especially good, since sometimes the stage combat is not fantastic.
Yeah, they had to play Khan off as being this stronger, 5 times stronger than Kirk, sort of.
Yeah,
Kirk. It's almost like a David and Goliath battle between the two, which Kirk has to resort to cheap methods to take him out.
Yeah,
whatever it takes, right?
Yeah.
That plus there's the ticking time bomb with the ship getting ready to blow, the classic Hitchcock technique.
Yeah, because Khan sets the engines to overload. Yeah. So, all right. So Jeff, thank you very much for joining me to discuss this episode.
Definitely glad to be part of it.